Hi, Squad. Welcome back to Crime Squad Podcast with me, your host, Natasha. Crime Squad Podcast covers both solved and unsolved Canadian true crime cases, and I release episodes monthly. I also release bonus content whenever I can. If this sounds like something you might enjoy, be sure to subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen. Today's episode is seriously infuriating. And I have a feeling that my anger will come out not only as I write it, but when I record it too. I understand the importance of being impartial and of having journalistic integrity, but here's the thing. I'm not a journalist. I'm a person who has always enjoyed research and a person who has taken many college and university level courses on psychology and crime. In another life, if things played out differently, I would have been in law enforcement or social work. Sometimes, though, life has other plans. Those of you who are part of the squad and tune in regularly will know I am a mother of 2 children under the age of 4. And as a mother, real talk, sometimes I feel totally overwhelmed. We're a pretty neurodivergent household, so things can seem extra challenging some days. Some days, when it's been a lot, after the kids are finally in bed, if I manage to get a second to myself, I'll cry. Toddlers have temper tantrums, it's true, but holy shit, nothing can prepare you for what it's like. Managing a baby and a screaming and flailing toddler at the same time is hard fucking work. Before I had kids, I used to hate hearing people go on and on about how great kids are and etc. But I'm telling you, things change when you have your own. I will never understand how a parent can abuse or kill their children. The thought leaves me feeling all kinds of emotion, from anger to nausea to such deep sadness, because the fact is, child abuse happens every day. It's an impossible reality to face because I don't know what I can do to help these poor children who need someone to love and care for them. It's a very difficult one for me because I fully understand there are mental health challenges that cause people to act in ways they never thought they could, such as postpartum depression, postpartum psychosis, depression, and many other disorders like borderline personality disorder, dependent personality disorder, and the list goes on. But something just hits differently for me when it's a person in a position of care who harms a child. It's something I have a difficult time reconciling, even if the perpetrator has been diagnosed with a mental illness. And I should know more than anyone how scary those thoughts can be. I had undiagnosed postpartum depression with my first child, and then my second child brought those feelings back full force. There were times where I'd be so upset I'd imagine running my car off the road with myself and my 2 kids inside. Those thoughts are so far from anything I'd actually do. But because I knew it wasn't right and it was scary to think these things, I spoke to my doctor. We managed through those symptoms, and I'm ashamed to say that I could even think those terrible things. And even though I know mental illness can make us think and do things we wouldn't if otherwise in a healthy mind state, I can't forgive these types of crimes. That being said, if you haven't already guessed, I want to warn you all that this case will feature violence against children, specifically vulnerable children who were diagnosed with disabilities. This episode may not be for everyone. Okay, squad, if you're ready, let's get into today's episode about the untimely deaths of Scarlett Chen and Katie Lynn Baker. Did you know that approximately 1 of every 50 Canadian children have been diagnosed with autism? And 2.5 out of every 1,000 children are born with cerebral palsy. In fact, there are roughly 4.4 million children and adults with disabilities in Canada, which equates to 1 in every 7 people. A disability is any condition of the body or mind, so like an impairment, that makes it more difficult for the person with the condition to do certain activities, which is equal to basically activity limitation, and interact with the world around them, so participation restrictions. Some children who are born or develop disabilities will need lifelong care. This can create challenging situations within the family unit. Parents of children with disabilities come from every social class and every race. The issue that continuously presents itself is the negative mindset related to people with disabilities. There are widespread negative myths about the limitations and way of life for these children and their caregivers. Tragically, people with disabilities are 5 times more likely to suffer abuse than people who don't have disabilities. There is a sense of shame that seems to burden parents of children with disabilities, and this can lead to a power dynamic that shifts into abuse. After all, children are some of the most vulnerable people in society, and adding an intellectual or physical disability makes them that much more reliant on caregiver for the necessities of life. A child with an inability to properly hear, see, move, communicate, get dressed, go to the toilet, or bathe independently is at great risk of rough, careless, or intrusive personal care or other neglect. The differences in ability can make it difficult to participate in family and community activities without assistance, which can lead to social isolation. And isolation is a major risk factor for abuse. Obviously, I'm not reducing the emotional, financial, and physical strain that is likely to occur where caregivers of disabled children are concerned. I'm sure parents or caregivers often feel alone and isolated when it comes to the daily tasks of caring for a vulnerable individual. Stress can cause its own issues, such as ongoing healthcare needs, inability to find sufficient childcare equipped to manage the child's differences, not to mention the financial burdens of ongoing medical care or special equipment. These factors have been known to cause social isolation issues, depression, and marital breakdown. Filicide is defined as the murder of a child by a parent. And when it comes to children with disabilities, there is a cycle. A parent kills their disabled child, and the media then portrays the child as being a burden or challenge. This paints the murder as justified or inevitable. If the parent is arrested and goes to trial, they are viewed with sympathy and often given light sentences, if they're convicted at all. This leads to the victim being blamed for their own demise, even though the caregiver should have been the person the child could trust the most. The victim and their situation is swept under the rug and forgotten. The media then sends the message that if a disabled child is murdered by a parent, they will be given leniency due to the difficulties faced in managing a child with a disability. Parents who have children with disabilities see these news reports, read the paper. A parent then kills their disabled child. I like to think that Canada has come a long way when it comes to accessibility for Canadians with disabilities. In 2020, I was the accessibility designate for my large corporate employer, and I had to have extensive knowledge of the various legalities surrounding people with disabilities in Canada and ensure we were meeting the requirements. It was a lot of meeting with lawyers, a lot of documentation, and a lot of action plans and strategies to ensure we're able to meet the deadlines imposed by the Canadian government. I will say this, I learned a lot, and I was able to see where my able-bodied privileges come in. It challenged a lot about what I thought and felt about people who have disabilities. The fact is, though, we live in a world where people think disabled lives have less value than people without disabilities. Do you agree? Disagree? Let me know on social media. Autistic Advocacy released an anti-filicide toolkit in January of 2024, and it's an amazing informational resource. This really hit me, quote, "When parents of kids without disabilities murder their children, we are universally united in condemnation. It is only when the victim is disabled that we pause. It is only when the victim is disabled that we are encouraged to understand. This is a double standard, and it reveals dangerous things about our beliefs." End quote. July 12th, 2004. It was a hot day in Scarborough, Ontario. 33-year-old David Chen said goodbye to his wife and child as he left home to go help his friends move their belongings into their new home. The friends had just immigrated to Canada from China, where David had lived prior to coming to Canada with his own family, wife Linda, daughter Scarlett, and his mother-in-law. He was set on going to help his friends get settled in their new home and also visit their new baby. David planned on being home later in the evening. He was hopeful his daughter would still be awake so he could greet her before she went to bed. His mother-in-law was absent from the home that evening as well, but there was no concern because Linda, his wife, and his child's mother was perfectly capable and there to care for their daughter. At around 7:30 p.m. that evening, David arrived home and greeted his wife, Linda. He fully expected their daughter, Scarlett, to come running and greet him just as she did every time he returned home from work. When that didn't happen, he asked Linda where Scarlett was, and Linda told him she'd put Scarlett to bed around 6:30. David went into the room where Scarlett should be sleeping peacefully, but she wasn't there. He went into the bathroom where he saw something horrific, something he could never unsee. The bathtub was filled with water and laundry, and among the linens was a lifeless body of his daughter. He immediately called 911, but it was just after 8 p.m., July 12th, that Scarlett would be pronounced dead. Scarlett Chen was born in 2001. She spent most of her life in China, where her mother and father lived prior to coming to Canada. Her father, David Chen, and mother, Shuang Peng, also known as Linda Peng, met in China while David was studying engineering. The couple would eventually wed and then create their beautiful little girl, Scarlett. In 1999, David and Linda decided to move to Canada, and they chose to settle in Scarborough, Ontario. Scarlett had stayed in China with her grandmother, Linda's mother. After a couple of years in Ontario, Linda and David purchased a 3-story townhouse condo, and about 6 months after that, both Scarlett and Linda's mother arrived in Canada to begin a new life here as a family of 4. David and Linda were in their early 30s, and while David went to work as an IT consultant, Linda stayed at home as the family's homemaker. Her mother, who lived with them, assisted her with raising little Scarlett. The couple noticed Scarlett seemed to have some speech delays, and this prompted them to seek medical care to determine if there was any underlying causes for this. Their concerns were mostly around the speech delay. Scarlett, who was 4 years old, hadn't been expressing herself verbally at all. As a result of the testing that was conducted, Scarlett was diagnosed with a mild form of autism. The speech delay was a clear marker, as well as her cognitive ability. She was reportedly delayed by at least 2 years. And this is where the cracks began in the relationship between Linda and her little girl. I think it's important to note that Linda had, in 2002, experienced mental health challenges that later led her to being diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Whether or not that played a factor in what happened with Scarlett remains unknown, and I don't at all want to insinuate that people with bipolar disorder are more likely to commit violent acts. That's not what I'm saying. The truth is, although there is a link between bipolar disorder and increased aggression, the vast majority of people with bipolar disorder are not dangerous. Scarlett, like any 4-year-old, and trust me, I can actually say this because my son is a maniac and we joke that he is a tornado, could be unruly. Kids this age don't yet have emotional regulation or logic or the desire to listen a whole lot. The family was also struggling with how to handle Scarlett's autism diagnosis. On July 12, 2004, the family received news on Scarlett's condition. They had been trying to find solutions for Scarlett and her diagnosis, but instead they had been told the condition could not be cured by surgery. The doctor told them Scarlett would apparently not ever function normally and would need assistance for the rest of her life. There would be no quick fix. On July 12, 2004, after receiving a prognosis based on the opinion of one doctor in a time where neurodivergence was so ambiguous, Scarlett was left in the care of her mother, Linda, while her father and grandmother were out of the house. In her 4 short years, she had never been left alone with her mother. Someone else was always around. According to Linda, Scarlett began to misbehave. Linda just wanted to get a head start on some chores she had to do, which included soaking laundry. Clearly, getting overwhelmed, Linda decided to put Scarlett to bed so the child would stay out of her way and allow her to finish her tasks. But Scarlett was defiant. She just would not lay down and go to sleep. Linda was obviously struggling because she called her husband David over a dozen times asking when he would be home to relieve her of the parenting duties. As Linda drew a bath to soak the laundry, Scarlett watched her mother running water into the bathtub with interest. She took off her clothes and tried multiple times to get into the bath among the linens and water, fascinated by what was going on. And Linda? Well, Linda snapped. News outlets reported it almost with sympathy. How tragic it was that this little girl would never be normal. Wasn't it better to put her out of her misery? No. The fact is, Linda took it upon herself to murder her own child. She held Scarlett's head under the water in the bathtub until she stopped moving. Then she calmly went downstairs as though nothing happened, turned on the TV, and waited for her husband to come home. She lied to him when he arrived, telling him outright that Scarlett was sleeping in her room. It took 7 months for police to arrest Linda, and they finally did in March of 2005. At trial, Linda denied causing harm to her daughter. She maintained it was an accidental drowning. Despite this, evidence, including bruising on the back of Scarlett's neck and head, led the judge to convict Linda to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 10 years. Linda consistently maintained her innocence, appealing her case and winning the appeal for a retrial. It was then that Linda's lawyers argued she should be charged with manslaughter instead of first-degree murder, which was the initial crime she was charged with. Finally, Linda confessed to her guilt, providing the court with her admission of what really happened on that hot summer day in July of 2004. With this guilty plea came a plea deal, which meant that after serving only 30 months of her sentence, Linda was released from prison. David Chen had always stood by his wife, defending her passionately. He told anyone who would listen that his wife was just not capable of committing such a horrific act and that it was an accidental death. When Linda finally admitted what she had done and that it was not accidental, David was no longer around to support her. The couple divorced soon after. Chillingly, Linda seems to be more than ready to move on with her life. Just 2 hours after pleading guilty, she was quoted as saying, "I love Scarlett, but I hate autism." She admitted this was, quote, "This is the most stupid thing I have ever done in my life. I will feel great regret for the rest of my life. I will be a great mother." She professed wanting more children, stating, quote, "I won't kill another baby. I won't. I will be a good mother," end quote. It is unknown where Linda Peng is today, but she certainly isn't behind bars. The advancements in even just the last 10 years regarding people with autism could have made life drastically different for Scarlett and her family. Instead, her life was snuffed out because her mother was too overwhelmed that day to handle the message that the diagnosis meant she would never be normal, according to that doctor. And she was also caring for her daughter solo for the first time. It's unforgivable, and I truly do believe Linda should have served a lengthier sentence. Rest in peace, Scarlett, wherever you are. The story of Katie Lynn Baker is surely one to pull on heartstrings. One school of thought praises her mother, Cheryl McLean, for her actions. The other condemns her. I'll let you be the judge, but ultimately I have my own bias, which will most certainly be part of this segment. Katie Lynn Baker was born in British Columbia in 1986 to mother Cheryl McLean and father Dale Baker. As Katie grew in her first year, her parents noticed she seemed to be a little slower in development. Cheryl had other children in addition to Katie, so she was a good judge of whether or not Katie was progressing through the natural milestones. The family pursued medical assistance, and in 1987, when Katie was 15 months old, she was diagnosed with Rett syndrome. For those of you who don't know, Rett syndrome is a genetic disorder that occurs due to a mutation in the MECP2 gene, which is located on the X chromosome. This gene is integral to brain development as well as activating and deactivating other gene functions. When the MECP2 gene does not properly function, it can impact issues through the whole body. Rett syndrome is not hereditary. It is a spontaneous occurrence, usually due to random changes in the genetic code during conception. Rett syndrome is not discriminatory. It can affect any racial or ethnic group. However, Rett is most common in females, affecting approximately 1 in 10,000 births worldwide. Males do get diagnosed, but at a much lesser rate. There is no specific treatment for Rett's, and while it is not a degenerative disorder, and many people live full lives, people with Rett syndrome will need care for the rest of their lives. Symptoms of Rett syndrome develop in stages. Stage 1, or early onset, begins when an infant is between 6 and 18 months of age. Stage 1 can last for any time between a few months or even up to a year. Infants begin to miss milestones, such as making purposeful eye contact, losing interest in toys, and delays with sitting, crawling, or walking. Stage 2 starts between the ages of 1 to 4 years old, and in this stage, children begin to rapidly deteriorate. They lose the ability to perform skills they had already developed. And some of the physical characteristics of Rett's include slowed head growth, abnormal hand movements, screaming or crying for no apparent reason, and problems with movement and coordination. They also lose interest in interacting and communicating in social settings. Stage 3 is a plateau period that begins between the ages of 2 and 10 and can last many years, even into adulthood. Behaviors improve, but physical impairments continue. Stage 4 typically begins after the age of 10 and can last for decades. Mobility begins to reduce, and muscle weakness and scoliosis can occur. In and of itself, Rett syndrome is not a death sentence. There are, of course, complications that can arise due to the symptoms. For example, sleep problems such as sleep apnea can have negative long-term effects and impact quality of life. Bowel and bladder issues, pain, heart problems, and difficulty eating, which can lead to delayed growth and malnutrition. I know all of that sounds absolutely horrific, but who are we to judge someone's quality of life? I think a lot of our perception about disability lies in the fact that we've only known our own experiences based on our own existence. Let me see if I can explain this in a different way. People who hear about my life, including various forms of childhood trauma, always seem to think that they have to apologize to me for what I went through. And I understand, I get it. Thank you for your empathy. Thank you for your care and concern. But the reality is, I really knew no different. It's not like I had anything else to compare it to. My upbringing was my upbringing. Do I realize now how toxic or wrong a lot of it was? Yes, of course. And I've worked tirelessly to be the kind of person I respect and admire, breaking the cycle, if you will, versus settling into old narratives and familial storylines. One thing I often do when debating about difficult and emotionally charged conversation topics is focus on facts versus feelings. It takes practice, and obviously life isn't as black and white as that. But if you look at the facts, is living with an impairment a life not worth living? And who is deciding what a life worth living looks like? By whose standards? This is food for thought. Hold that thought. Back to little Katie's story. She had been diagnosed with Rett syndrome, which almost certainly meant a lifelong journey with medical professionals. And with a long-standing medical issue comes emotional challenges, physical limitations. And of course, we can't forget the fact that as a parent, you must mourn the vision you had of a happy, healthy child that makes their way into adulthood. You have to come to terms with the reality of the situation. Photographs of Katie show a stunningly beautiful little girl. She has these dark, soulful brown eyes, a button nose, and full little lips. She also has a head full of dark, thick hair. She looks like a very sweet child. Katie was a person afflicted with a disability, but Katie was also a daughter, a sister to 7 siblings, a student. People with Rett syndrome may not be verbal, but they can communicate with their eyes, such as signaling they want a particular item by gazing at it. They can also use alternate forms of communication, such as picture boards. Katie actually attended school, and she was very well liked. Katie's 3rd grade teacher, Mrs. Beth McClellan, said of Katie, quote, "Some kids are like light bulbs. They shine, and she was one of them," end quote. Students loved Katie just as much as our teachers. One year at a skating rink at the school, students helped Katie to experience skating by whipping her around in a plastic lawn chair across the ice. Katie was having a fantastic time. She was howling with delight. Katie was also a bit of a jokester. She would apparently sometimes fake that she stopped breathing just to get a rise. And according to her teacher and the principal at the time, Clive Hickson, Katie could nod or shake her head for yes and no. She also once said the word yes. Katie had likes and dislikes. She liked pizza. She loved Saturday cartoons and snuggles on the couch. If you didn't know Katie had to be fed, dressed, and needed assistance walking, you may not see anything wrong with the description. We have what sounds like a playful child, not ruled solely by the disability that she had. One of the main difficulties of Rett syndrome is food restriction and avoidance. Chewing and swallowing is difficult due to slowed muscle growth. Digestion is also difficult due to relaxed abdominal muscles, which can lead to constipation and other gastrointestinal issues. This is where a nutritionist would be an absolute asset to assist with lessening the unwanted issues while also ensuring a person with Rett's would have adequate nutritional value. If I put myself in Cheryl McLean's shoes for a moment, I don't know how she did it. 8 children under her roof, with one of them requiring extra care. The understanding was that some of the older children would help as much as possible. And this is how Katie's sister Krista took on so many familial responsibilities. For instance, Krista, who was just 13 years old herself, was responsible for getting Katie ready for school each morning, making Katie's breakfast and lunch daily, and also she cooked dinner for the whole family 3 times a week. If Cheryl wasn't available for whatever reason, be it a job or otherwise, Krista would be left alone to manage not just Katie, but also their 2 brothers, who were just 3 and 5 years old. This would often be an overnight scenario as well. Because of the family situation, social workers were assigned to check in and to make sure things were going okay. Katie also seemed to be thriving with the assistance of Mary Ann Cook, her full-time caregiver. Mary Ann was Katie's caregiver for 2 years, from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., 5 days a week. She even stayed with Katie while she was at school. But it was March of 1996 that things took a turn for the worst. Katie's caregiver, Mary Ann, became ill and was unable to continue caring for Katie while she took much-needed time away to recover. Because Mary Ann was responsible for getting Katie and her sister Krista to and from school, the girls dropped out for approximately 6 weeks. Katie returned to school May 13th, but her appearance was extremely shocking. Principal Clive Hickson was so disturbed by what he saw, he immediately sought the assistance of a social worker. He was afraid for Katie's life. Katie Baker was 10 years old in 1996 and had been taken out of school for 6 weeks in the absence of her caretaker. Katie returned to school in May, but she was a shell of a person. Where she once had vibrant, bright eyes and a playful attitude, she was now extremely emaciated. Clive Hickson, the principal of the school, said, quote, "Her lips were completely pulled back from her teeth, her eyes sunken and dull. Her face was gaunt and pale. Her hands were all gnarled up. The closest thing I could think of was a concentration camp victim. It was horrific." End quote. Clive called a social worker immediately and explained Katie appeared malnourished, dehydrated, and that her legs were covered in bruises. He felt if Katie was left alone, she was so close to death that she would pass away. Cheryl McLean, as if sensing this was all happening, called Principal Hickson later that day and advised him regarding Katie's condition that she'd be discussing the situation with doctors. She explained to Clive that kids with Rett syndrome tend to go through a regression between the ages of 10 to 14, and it's often a death sentence. Cheryl seemed convinced that because Katie was 10 years old, she was probably dying. She also mentioned during this same heavy conversation that she was seeking a foster family for Katie and that it would allow the foster family to receive $2,100 monthly, tax-free, to help in providing Katie care. Social workers visited the household that evening, but somehow decided they wouldn't be taking Katie to a hospital for assessment. The claims made by the social workers were that, in part, they didn't want to anger Cheryl, but also Cheryl had convinced them that Katie wanted to die. Katie wanted to die. This is where the schools of thought divide. Cheryl believed she knew Katie well enough to know Katie was tired of living life. Cheryl felt Katie had been through so much already. Multiple doctor visits, constant confirmation there was no cure for Rett syndrome, frequent issues with digestion. Katie told Cheryl with her eyes that her refusal to eat meant she wanted to die. And so, Cheryl let Katie die. Cheryl packed up Katie at the end of May 1996, took her to a friend's house, and stopped feeding her. It took 4 days for Katie to finally die. At the age of 10, she weighed just 20 pounds. 20 pounds. Supporters of Cheryl believe this was an act of supreme love. Cheryl advocated for her daughter. Cheryl listened to her daughter saying everything she couldn't say. Cheryl felt that Katie knew what she was doing when she was refusing food and water, and that force-feeding Katie was unethical. An inquest was called into Katie's untimely death, and her death was ruled as a homicide. Death by starvation. Would Cheryl see a conviction? Jail time? No. Charges would not be laid in Katie's death. Instead, it was made clear to those who require caregivers that their lives can be ended simply because their life isn't deemed worth living. The facts, when you strip away everything else, are that Cheryl McLean starved her 10-year-old child until she died. Katie would have looked horrific at the end of her life. 20 pounds for a 10-year-old child is next to nothing. My 4-year-old weighs 38 pounds and is considered underweight for his age. The fact is, there is no way Katie Baker could have communicated with her eyes that she wanted to die. That is a decision far more complex in nature than a simple eye movement. Katie could say yes or no with her gazes. She could express herself that way, but to validate her mother's assumption that death was the only option? No, I don't buy it. Sympathizers of Cheryl, whom we can also call ableist people, use language such as, "I don't know how you were able to cope with having a disabled daughter. I don't blame you for wanting to end things for Katie. She had gone through so much." What these statements point out more than anything is a point of view that is completely one-sided, and it's caked with negativity. It amplifies the belief that a disabled life is not worth living, that a disabled life is a grand tragedy marked only with suffering. But we need to ask ourselves, is that really how it is? How can we judge a life we've never lived? Does perceived suffering outweigh outward displays of enjoyment? When Katie got to have pizza and watch Saturday cartoons, did she want to die? Was having difficulty eating and digesting food a reason for Katie to want to starve herself to death? What's worse? I understand there's a lot of talk about medical assistance in dying. And much like the case of Tracy Latimer, a child of Katie's age would not be able to make that decision to die on their own. Even if they professed wanting to no longer be alive, a child is not capable of understanding the true implications of what that means. There's a reason why children are defined as such. It seems like so many people failed Katie. Doctors, social workers, her own mother. Unfortunately, because criminal charges were never laid in Katie's death, it further emboldens people to believe Cheryl is innocent, that Cheryl's decision to starve her daughter to death was an act of compassion. What side of this divide do you fall on? Rest in peace, Katie. I hope you are enjoying the skating rink wherever you are. Well, squad, this was a heavy one. It took me far too long to write and research because I was avoiding the subject matter. In fact, I was actually going to include another individual as part of this episode, but my mental health would not allow for it. Thanks for tuning in and listening. I hope you had a fantastic month, and I look forward to getting another episode out next month. If you have any ideas for an episode, don't hesitate to reach out. You can reach me on social media. I'm on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook, or by email. I always love hearing from fans. Other than that, stay safe, everyone. Be kind to each other.